My name's Eric, 35, and until recently, I thought my life was pretty solid. I've been married to Jessica, 33, for 6 years, and we have one son, Max, who's 4. Jessica is smart, gorgeous, and funny, the kind of person who lights up a room. Or at least, that's what I used to think. We met through mutual friends at a party, and it was one of those whirlwind romances where everything just clicked. She was working in PR, and I was an engineer, two completely different worlds, but it worked. We moved into a cozy little house in the suburbs, got a golden retriever named Scout, and settled into what I thought was our perfect life. The cracks started appearing a few months ago, though I didn't notice them right away. Jessica's phone was always buzzing, and she'd laugh at messages she wouldn't share. Work stuff, she'd say. You know how it is? I didn't, but I trusted her. She also started dressing up more for her supposed girls' nights, even wearing perfume she hadn't touched in years. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, convincing myself I was overthinking. After all, we still had date nights. She still kissed me goodbye in the mornings, and we were still planning a family vacation to Disney World. But looking back, I should have known something was wrong when her best friend, Rachel, started acting weird around me, like she knew something she didn't want to tell me. Then last week, everything changed. It started with a stupid little detail. One night, Jessica was getting ready for another one of her girls' nights, which had become a weekly thing. She looked incredible, hair curled, a sleek black dress hugging her figure, and heels that made her legs look miles long. I couldn't help but joke. You sure you're going out with Rachel? You look like you're meeting the president. She laughed a little too hard and said, Eric, stop. You know I like to look good. I let it go, but as she walked out the door, I caught a whiff of her perfume. It wasn't the light floral scent she usually wore. It was something muskier, more intense. A scent I hadn't smelled in years, maybe not since we first started dating. When I mentioned it to Rachel the next day, while dropping Max off at daycare, Rachel works there part-time. Her reaction was strange. Her eyes widened, and she hesitated for just a second too long before saying, Oh yeah, Jess mentioned she bought a new perfume. Guess she's feeling fancy these days. It wasn't the words that got me. It was the way she said them, like she was choosing her words carefully. I let it slide, but that nagging feeling in my gut grew stronger. Later that week, I was cleaning out the car when I found an unfamiliar receipt stuffed under the passenger seat. It was from a fancy restaurant downtown, the kind of place Jess and I used to go for anniversaries. The date on it? 2 weeks ago. The total? Enough for 2 entrees, dessert, and a bottle of wine. I called Rachel that night. I told myself it was casual, just checking in to see how her girls' night had been, but I couldn't stop my voice from shaking. Eric, she said after a long pause, I think you should talk to Jessica. That was the moment I knew. Something was off. Something big. Rachel's cryptic response lingered in my mind, like a splinter I couldn't pull out. I didn't push her for more, though. Part of me wasn't ready to know. Instead, I started paying closer attention to Jessica, watching for anything that might confirm or disprove the suspicions swirling in my head. The changes were subtle at first. She was on her phone constantly, smiling at texts she wouldn't share. When I'd ask her about her day, she'd give vague answers, saying she was swamped or that work was a nightmare. But it didn't seem like a nightmare. She was glowing, almost giddy at times. The next weekend, she had another girls' night planned. This time, I offered to drive her. Oh, that's sweet, she said, brushing me off. But I'm meeting Rachel at her place first, and it's way out of your way. Still, I insisted. I don't mind. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but then she recovered, laughing. Eric, don't be ridiculous. I'll just call a rideshare. You don't need to chauffeur me around. She booked the ride while I watched, but something about the exchange felt rehearsed. When the car pulled up, she kissed me goodbye, a quick peck on the cheek, and waved as the driver took off. I stood there, watching the taillights fade, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. An hour later, Rachel called me. Hey, Eric, she said, her voice unusually cheerful. Just wanted to say thanks for dropping Jessica off earlier. My blood ran cold. What? I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She said she was meeting you at your place. There was a beat of silence. Oh yeah, right. She's here now. We just didn't want you to go out of your way. It was a terrible lie, and we both knew it. My hands clenched in a fist as I forced myself to play along. Got it? Have fun, then. I hung up and stared at the phone, my heart pounding. Jessica wasn't with Rachel. So where the hell was she? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jessica's absence gnawing at me like a dog with a bone. She came home around midnight, tiptoeing through the house as if she didn't want to wake me. I pretended to be asleep, but my ears perked up when I heard her mutter something under her breath. The next morning, everything seemed normal. Too normal. She was cheerful, making pancakes for Max and humming along to the radio like nothing had happened. But I noticed little things. How she avoided looking at me. How she kept her phone angled away whenever it buzzed. How she didn't mention Rachel or the supposed girls' night. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. Later that day, while she was taking a shower, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went through her phone. The guilt hit me immediately, but I pushed it aside, telling myself I had to know the truth. Her texts with Rachel were innocent enough, just typical back and forth about their kids and work. But then I saw a string of messages with someone saved as M. My heart sank as I opened the thread. M. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. Jessica. Me too. You always know how to make me feel amazing. My hands were shaking as I scrolled further. The messages were flirty, intimate, things she hadn't said to me in years. There were no explicit details, no smoking gun, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it, my mind racing. Who the hell was him? A coworker? Someone from the gym? A stranger she met online? The next clue came 2 days later. Jessica left for work in a hurry, forgetting her laptop bag on the kitchen counter. When I grabbed it to bring it to her, a folded piece of paper fell out. It was a handwritten note, and the sight of it made my blood run cold. Can't wait to see you again. Counting the days. M. I stood there, staring at the note, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to confront her, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed more. Something concrete. Something undeniable. That night, I called Rachel again. I know something's going on, I said, skipping the pleasantries. She's lying to me, Rachel, and I think you know what it is. There was a long pause before Rachel finally sighed. Eric, you need to follow her. Follow her? I repeated, stunned. You're telling me to spy on my wife? I'm telling you to get the truth, she said, her voice firm. Because she's not going to give it to you herself. Rachel's words echoed in my head for days. Follow her. Get the truth. I hated the idea of playing detective, but I also couldn't let this go. Jessica's lies were piling up, and every time I looked at her, all I could see was that note from M. My chest tightened every time her phone buzzed or she smiled at a message. I started noticing other odd things, too. At Max's preschool drop-off, one of the other moms, Kelly, gave me a strange look. I didn't think much of it until she pulled me aside as I was heading back to my car. Hey, Eric, she said, her tone cautious. Everything okay? Yeah, I replied, though my voice betrayed my unease. Why do you ask? She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. I've just noticed Jessica has been spending a lot of time downtown lately. I figured it was for work, but my stomach dropped. Downtown? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. What do you mean? Kelly shifted uncomfortably. I've seen her a couple of times, usually in the afternoon. She's always with this guy, tall, dark hair, kind of scruffy. I just assumed it was a work thing, but now... She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to stay calm. Thanks for letting me know, I said tightly. That night, I replayed Kelly's words over and over again. A guy downtown, tall, scruffy, and apparently close enough to Jessica that Kelly noticed. Was this him? If so, how many people knew about him? The next morning I got my answer. Jessica's mom, Carol, called me out of the blue. Carol and I have always been close. She practically considers me the son she never had. But her voice was off, shaky, like she didn't want to say what she was about to say. Eric, she began, I don't want to meddle, but I need to ask, is everything okay with you and Jessica? There it was again, that loaded question. Why do you ask? I said, my stomach churning. Well, it's probably nothing, but last weekend, when she came over to visit, she wasn't alone. She brought a man with her. Said he was a colleague, but Carol hesitated, clearly debating how much to tell me. There was something about the way they were talking, the way they looked at each other. It just didn't sit right with me. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Did she say his name? Yes, Carol said after a pause. Mark. Mark. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they weren't enough. Not yet. Thanks, Carol, I said, my voice tight. I'll handle it. That night, I couldn't even look at Jessica during dinner. My mind was racing, connecting dots I didn't want to connect. Mark was real. People had seen them together. And now, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I decided I'd follow her, just like Rachel suggested. If Jessica wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. As much as I wanted answers, I couldn't bring myself to confront Jessica outright. Every time I thought about sitting her down and demanding the truth, 1,000 doubts swirled in my head. What if I was wrong? What if I misunderstood Kelly or Carol or even Rachel? What if she had an innocent explanation for all of it, and I ended up looking like some paranoid fool? But deep down, I knew better. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was piling up like a brick wall I couldn't ignore. Still, I hesitated. Why? Because confronting her would make it real. Once the words were out, there was no taking them back. No pretending our life was anything other than a fractured mess. No turning away from the fact that Jessica might not be the person I thought she was. So, instead of confronting her, I found myself thinking about what adultery meant, what it said about her, and about me. I always thought I'd know what to do if I ever found myself in this situation. You leave. You don't tolerate disrespect. You don't stick around for someone who doesn't value you. But now that I was here, staring down the barrel of my wife's betrayal, the answers didn't seem so clear. What about Max? What would it do to him if we split up? And what about our life together? The house, the memories, the plans for the future. Could I just throw all of that away because of one terrible choice? Or was it more than one choice? That thought gnawed at me. Adultery wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern of deception, a series of deliberate acts that required planning and effort. She had to lie about where she was going, cover her tracks, and make excuses. It wasn't an accident. It was a betrayal, calculated and cruel. The idea of it made my blood boil. I couldn't stop imagining her with Mark, the way she might laugh at his jokes, the way her hand might linger on his arm. Did she talk about me to him? Did she complain about our life, about me as a husband? The thought that she might share parts of herself with someone else, parts she used to share with me, was like a knife in my chest. But then I thought about Max again, and the anger turned to sadness. If I blew up our marriage, I'd be blowing up his world too. Was it better to swallow my pride and try to fix things? Could I live with that? Could I live with her knowing she'd done this to me and gotten away with it? I was stuck, paralyzed by the weight of the decision I hadn't even made yet. And that's when I realized the real reason I hadn't confronted her. I wasn't ready to hear the truth. Because if she admitted it, if she looked me in the eye and said, "Yes, I'm having an affair," then I'd have to do something. I couldn't keep pretending. I'd have to make a choice. And the idea of it terrified me. So I waited. And I planned. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. The decision to follow Jessica wasn't easy. It felt underhanded, sneaky, exactly the kind of behavior I was accusing her of. But every time I thought about confronting her directly, I froze. I needed proof, something concrete. If I didn't get the truth from her, I'd uncover it myself. The opportunity came 2 days later. Jessica was getting ready for another girls' night. As I watched her pull on her black heels and grab her bag, my heart pounded with equal parts guilt and anticipation. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, then called out as she walked out the door, "Don't wait up." I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway before grabbing my keys and following. She didn't head toward Rachel's house like she claimed. Instead, she took the highway downtown. My stomach tightened as I tailed her, keeping a safe distance. She eventually pulled into the parking lot of a trendy rooftop bar, a place we'd been to once years ago on an anniversary. I parked across the street, watching as she got out of the car. My heart sank when I saw him. A man with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard was waiting for her at the entrance. He smiled as she approached, pulling her into a hug that lingered far too long. This wasn't just a colleague. This was Mark. I stayed in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Watching them walk into the bar together felt like a punch to the gut, but it wasn't enough. I needed more. I waited for 20 agonizing minutes before getting out of the car and heading inside. The bar was crowded, dimly lit, and buzzing with conversation. I spotted Jessica and Mark almost immediately. They were seated in a corner booth, leaning in close, their faces lit by the flickering candlelight on the table. Jessica was laughing, her hand resting lightly on Mark's arm. The sight of it made my blood boil. How many times had we sat like that, in that exact kind of setting, sharing moments that I thought were ours alone? I stayed out of sight. Ordering a drink, I had no intention of drinking. I kept my distance, watching as they talked, laughed, and shared what looked like a bottle of wine. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. Then came the twist. Jessica pulled out her phone, showed something to Mark, and they both laughed. I couldn't see the screen, but when she set the phone on the table, I noticed something strange. It wasn't her usual phone. It was smaller, with a bright red case I'd never seen before. My mind raced. Did she have a second phone? One she didn't use around me? The implications of it made my stomach churn. Before I could think too much about it, they got up to leave. I followed them outside, keeping a safe distance as they walked down the street to a nearby hotel. My breath caught as they entered the lobby together, arm in arm, disappearing into the elevator. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my heart pounding in my chest. The betrayal wasn't just real, it was blatant right there in front of me. And now there was no denying it. But what was the deal with the second phone? Was this something she'd been using to hide her tracks? And if so, how long had this been going on? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not anymore. The walk back to my car was a blur. My mind raced, piecing together every lie, every excuse Jessica had ever given me. My chest burned with anger, but it wasn't the kind of anger that made you yell and scream. It was cold, calculated, the kind of anger that demanded retribution. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my dignity, my son, and the life I thought we were building together. If Jessica wanted to play games, I'd play them too, on my terms. The first step of my plan was to gather more evidence. I wasn't going to confront her until I had everything I needed to destroy the web of lies she'd spun. Her job, her friends, even her lover. I'd make sure every single one of them saw the real Jessica. The second phone was my starting point. That little red case was practically a smoking gun, and I was determined to get my hands on it. If she had been reckless enough to flash it in front of Mark, there was no telling what kind of secrets it held. The next morning, I told Jessica I had to leave early for work. I wasn't going to work. I was headed to Rachel's house. She was my last remaining lifeline to the truth. And after the scene at the bar, I needed her on my side. When Rachel opened the door, she looked surprised and nervous. "Eric, what's going on? Did you?" I nodded grimly. "I followed her. She's having an affair. With someone named Mark." Her shoulders slumped as if a weight had been lifted. "I was afraid of that," she said, motioning for me to come in. "I've known about Mark for a while, but I didn't have the heart to tell you." "You knew?" I said, my voice rising. "How could you not tell me?" "Because I thought she'd stop," Rachel said, her voice breaking. She swore it was just a fling, that it was over. "I didn't want to ruin your marriage if there was a chance she'd come to her senses." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. "Well, it's not over. And now she's hiding things like a second phone." Rachel's eyes widened. "I didn't know about that. She used it at the bar last night," I said. "It's probably how she's been keeping everything secret." Rachel hesitated, then said, "I can help you, Eric. If she's using that phone to communicate with Mark, I can try to get you access." I looked at her surprised. "Why would you help me now?" "Because I hate what she's doing," Rachel said, her voice firm. "And I hate that I've been complicit in it. You don't deserve this." That evening, Rachel texted Jessica, inviting her over for a glass of wine. "It's girl talk," Rachel explained to me. She won't bring the red phone if she thinks it's just me. Meanwhile, I set up in Rachel's guest room with a spare phone I connected to an app that mirrored Jessica's texts, emails, and call logs. If we could get access to her device, even briefly. It worked like a charm. Jessica arrived, unsuspecting, and Rachel kept her distracted with gossip and wine while I slipped into the living room. Sure enough, her red phone was in her purse, unguarded. My hands shook as I grabbed it and connected it to the app. It only took a few seconds, but what I saw was more than I expected. Dozens of texts to Mark, full of intimate details about their meetings, plans to travel together, and, worst of all, messages mocking me. Eric is so clueless. He doesn't even notice when I come home late. My stomach turned, but I kept going. I found photos, emails, and even receipts for expensive gifts she bought him. I copied everything, put the phone back exactly where I found it, and slipped out before Jessica even noticed. Back at home, I sat down with everything I'd gathered. Jessica thought she was untouchable, that I was oblivious. But now, I had the power. I wasn't going to yell or confront her. Not yet. First, I'd make sure everyone else knew exactly who she was. My plan was simple. I'd share the truth with the people who mattered most. Her parents, her co-workers, and even Mark himself. By the time I was done, Jessica's perfect little world would be in shambles. As I sifted through the evidence on Jessica's second phone, I thought I recognized this Mark from somewhere. Their texts, their plans, their inside jokes. It was like he'd been a part of her life for years, not months. The familiarity between them burned like salt in a wound, and I couldn't stop wondering, who the hell is this guy? I typed his name and phone number into Google, hoping to find something, anything, that would tell me more. It didn't take long to hit the jackpot. His social media profiles were public: Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all filled with photos of him living the high life. Fancy cars, trips to exotic locations, and pictures with smiling, adoring friends. And then I saw it. Buried deep in his Facebook photo albums, there was a picture from almost 8 years ago. It was taken at my wedding to Jessica. Mark was there, standing off to the side in a group shot of our guests, grinning like he belonged. My stomach dropped as I clicked on his profile and scrolled further back, finding more photos of him and Jessica together. Prom pictures, beach trips, parties. They'd been high school sweethearts. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. Jessica had invited him to our wedding. I vaguely remembered her mentioning an old friend from high school at the time, but I hadn't thought twice about it. I'd been too caught up in the chaos of planning and the whirlwind of the day itself to notice. Now I couldn't stop noticing. I started connecting dots I hadn't even realized were there. The times Jessica had gone to reunions or catching up with old friends. The nostalgic stories she'd told me about her high school days. Even the way she occasionally brought up her hometown with a wistful smile. Mark wasn't just some random fling. He was her past, a piece of her history that she'd held on to. And now, he'd wormed his way into her present and into my life. Fueled by a mix of anger and morbid curiosity, I dug deeper into Mark's online presence. His LinkedIn profile revealed he worked in sales for a luxury car dealership, a job that explained the flashy lifestyle. But there was something else that caught my eye: his location. He lived in our city. Not just that, but his dealership was only a few miles from Jessica's office. How long had this been going on? Did they reconnect at a high school reunion? Had she sought him out? Or had it been him? The questions were endless, and each one made me angrier. But the most damning piece of evidence came from a photo he'd posted just last week. It was of him at a bar downtown, the same bar I'd followed Jessica to. The caption read, "Great night catching up with an old flame. Some things never change." There were comments beneath it from his friends, joking about rekindling old sparks and calling him a lucky dog. I clenched my fists, barely resisting the urge to smash my laptop. Not only was Jessica betraying me, but she and Mark were flaunting it in plain sight. They weren't just sneaking around, they were reveling in it. That night, I sat down with everything I'd uncovered. The texts, the photos, the social media posts, they painted a clear picture. Jessica and Mark had history. They'd rekindled their romance, and now they were treating it like some grand love story. The betrayal felt even deeper now, knowing that Mark wasn't just a fling but someone Jessica had loved long before me. Someone she'd apparently never let go of. It made me question everything. Had I ever truly had her heart? Or had it always belonged to him, waiting for the right moment to resurface? But if Jessica thought she could have her cake and eat it too, she was wrong. My anger burned brighter than ever, and I was more determined than ever to take control. The next morning, I called Lisa, the lawyer Ryan had recommended weeks ago. I'd been sitting on her contact info, unsure if I was ready to take that step. But after uncovering Mark's history with Jessica and seeing the depth of their betrayal, I knew it was time. This wasn't just about confronting her anymore. It was about protecting myself and Max. And yes, maybe getting a little revenge along the way. Lisa's office was small but professional, tucked away in a modest building downtown. She greeted me with a firm handshake and a calm demeanor that instantly put me at ease. As we sat down in her office, she pulled out a notepad and clicked her pen. "So, Eric," she began, "tell me what's going on." I took a deep breath and launched into the story. I told her about Jessica's late nights, the second phone, and how I'd followed her to the bar in the hotel. I showed her the texts, the receipts, and the photo of Mark at our wedding. By the time I finished, Lisa's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to quiet outrage. "You've been thorough," she said, flipping through the stack of evidence I'd handed her. "This is quite the situation." "Yeah," I said, leaning back in my chair. "And I'm not just here to figure out divorce papers. I need advice on how to handle this without losing everything." Lisa nodded, scribbling notes. "First, let's talk about your rights. Given the evidence you've collected, you're in a strong position. The affair not only establishes grounds for divorce, but also gives you leverage if you want custody of Max." "That's what I'm worried about," I said. "Max, I don't want him caught in the middle of this. I want to make sure he's okay, no matter what happens." "And we'll do that," Lisa assured me. "But Eric, I need to ask, are you looking to resolve this as cleanly as possible, or—" I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I want revenge," I admitted, my voice low. "I want her to feel the way I feel. To lose the thing she's taken for granted." Lisa raised an eyebrow, but didn't judge. "Revenge can be a slippery slope," she said carefully. "But I understand where you're coming from. You've been betrayed, and you're angry. The important thing is to channel that anger productively. We don't want to do anything that could backfire on you, legally or otherwise." I nodded, appreciating her level-headed approach. "I'm not looking to do anything reckless. I want people to know the truth. Her parents, our friends, even her coworkers. And Mark, I want him to know I'm not some clueless idiot." Lisa leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "If that's the route you want to take, we need to be strategic. You have enough evidence to make a strong case, not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. But Eric, you need to be prepared for the fallout. Once this goes public, it could get messy." "I'm ready," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not going to let her walk all over me." Lisa studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, here's what I suggest. First, we start laying the groundwork for the divorce. Financial records, custody arrangements, the works. Second, if you want to confront her publicly, we can craft a plan that protects you while exposing the truth." I like the sound of that. "And Mark?" I asked, my voice colder now. "What about him?" Lisa's lips curved into a subtle smile. "Oh, I think we can include him in the plan. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting the facts speak for themselves." As I left Lisa's office, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. I felt empowered for the first time in weeks, like I was finally taking control of the situation. But I also felt the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't going to be easy or pretty. But if Jessica and Mark thought they could play me for a fool, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The week off from work wasn't really a vacation. It was survival. I told Jessica I wasn't feeling well, blaming a vague stomach bug. She seemed indifferent, brushing me off with a distracted, "Hope you feel better, babe," before heading off to work each morning. That suited me fine. I didn't want her sympathy. I wanted space. Most of my days were spent in the garage, working out my anger on a punching bag. It wasn't enough, though. No matter how hard I hit it, no matter how much I imagined Mark's face in place of the bag, the rage didn't leave. It just simmered beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. By Friday, I was a mess. Half drunk on whiskey and pent-up fury, I paced the house while Jessica was at work, trying to figure out what to do. I knew she was planning to see Mark that night. I'd overheard her on the phone, whispering about meeting a friend. She didn't even bother to hide it anymore. I followed her again. This time, I didn't bother to keep my distance. I didn't care if she saw me. I wanted her to. Fueled by liquid courage and raw anger, I tailed her to a parking lot near the same rooftop bar I'd followed her to before. She got out of the car, and there he was, Mark, waiting for her like some smug predator. I watched as she walked up to him, smiling, her hand brushing his arm. They leaned in close, and that was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the half-empty beer bottle from the passenger seat, shoved open the door, and stormed toward them. "Hey, Jessica," I called, my voice sharp and slurred. "Nice night for a date, huh?" Jessica froze, her face draining of color as she turned to face me. Mark, on the other hand, looked more annoyed than anything, like I was some nuisance interrupting his plans. "What the hell are you doing here, Eric?" Jessica hissed, glancing around nervously. "What am I doing here?" I spat, holding up the beer bottle like it was an accusation. "I'm just here to say hi to my wife and her boyfriend." Mark stepped forward, his hands raised in a mockingly placating gesture. "Hey man, I think you've had a little too much to drink. Maybe you should. Shut the hell up," I barked, cutting him off. "You don't get to talk to me. You think I don't know who you are? Mark, right? High school sweetheart? The guy who couldn't keep his hands off my wife at our wedding." Mark's smirk faltered, and he glanced at Jessica, who was looking anywhere but at me. "Eric, this isn't the time or place," she said, her voice trembling. "Not the time or place?" I said, laughing bitterly. "When is the time, Jessica? When you're sneaking out of our bed to meet him?" Mark stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "Look, I don't want any trouble." "Oh, you don't want trouble?" I snapped. "Well, guess what? You found it." Before I even realized what I was doing, I swung the beer bottle. It wasn't a hard hit, more of a clumsy swipe, but it connected with Mark's shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing, while Jessica let out a panicked scream. "Eric, stop," she shouted, stepping between us. "What are you doing?" "What am I doing?" I said, breathing heavily. "What are you doing, Jessica?" "Sneaking around, lying to me, destroying everything we built." Mark stood off to the side, rubbing his shoulder and glaring at me like he wanted to hit me back, but didn't dare. Jessica grabbed my arm, trying to pull me away, but I shrugged her off. "I don't want to see you again," I said, my voice breaking. "You've ruined our lives, Jessica. I'm filing for divorce. You can have him. He's all yours." Her face crumpled, tears spilling over as she tried to speak. "Eric, please, Save it," I said, turning on my heel and walking away. I drove straight to a hotel, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't know where else to go. I just knew I couldn't stay under the same roof as her. Not after what had just happened. The room was small and impersonal, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating tension at home. I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the night replayed in my head. The fight hadn't made me feel better. If anything, it had left me feeling hollow, drained. The rage was gone, replaced by an aching sadness that I couldn't shake. Jessica's betrayal was more than just infidelity. It was the destruction of the life we'd built together. And now I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. Alone. I woke up in the hotel room the morning after the parking lot incident, my head pounding, not from the beer, but from the sheer weight of everything that had happened. The previous night played in my mind on a loop. Jessica's startled face, Mark's smug expression, the bottle connecting with his shoulder. It was all a blur, but one thing was crystal clear. I couldn't go back. Not now. I didn't check my phone. I couldn't bring myself to. I knew Jessica had probably called, probably texted, but I wasn't ready to hear her excuses or fake apologies. Not after everything I'd seen, everything I knew. The woman I thought I'd married didn't exist anymore. Or maybe she never had. By mid-morning, I finally forced myself to glance at my phone. 15 missed calls. Half a dozen voicemails. Dozens of texts. I didn't open any of them. What could she possibly say that would change anything? The lies, the betrayal, it was all too much. I tossed the phone onto the bedside table and left the room to grab some coffee from the hotel lobby. When I came back, the receptionist stopped me. "Mr. Hall?" I turned, confused. "Yeah, a note was left for you," she said, handing me a small envelope. I took it without a word and headed back to my room. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally tearing it open. Jessica's handwriting stared back at me, neat and familiar, but the words on the page made my stomach turn. "Eric, please. I know you're angry, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to talk to me. For Max, if nothing else. I love you. I always have, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to fix this. Jessica." I crumpled the note in my hand, my jaw tightening. Talk to her? After everything? After the lies, the sneaking around, the blatant disrespect? She wanted me to just sit down and listen to her try to justify ruining our lives? I threw the crumpled note onto the nightstand and leaned back against the bed. My chest felt heavy, my breathing uneven. Part of me wanted to call her, to scream at her, to let her know exactly how much damage she'd done. But what good would that do? She already knew. The other part of me, the angrier, more rational part, knew I needed to stay away. I couldn't let her manipulate me with tears and promises she didn't mean. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Max. And he deserved better than to watch his parents spiral into a mess of resentment and blame. I picked up my phone and blocked her number. It wasn't permanent. At least I didn't think it was, but I needed space. Real space. The kind that let me think clearly without her voice clouding my judgment. For the rest of the day, I paced the hotel room, the note lying crumpled on the nightstand like a symbol of everything I didn't want to face. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd built my life with turned into someone who could hurt me so deeply? And what did it say about me that I hadn't seen it coming? That I'd been so wrapped up in work, in providing for our family, that I hadn't noticed her slipping away? But no, that wasn't fair. This wasn't my fault. I'd given her everything. My love, my trust, my loyalty, and she'd thrown it away for some fantasy with a man who didn't have to deal with the realities of marriage, kids, and life. I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to talk to her. Not now. Maybe not ever. If she wanted to explain herself, she could do it to our lawyer. Because as far as I was concerned, Jessica had already said everything that mattered without saying a word. She'd chosen Mark, and I was done. 2 days after the fight, I was sitting on the hotel bed, staring at the TV without really watching it. The room was dim, the curtains drawn tight to block out the daylight. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with Rachel's name. I almost ignored it. I wasn't in the mood for another conversation, another round of rehashing what happened. But something made me pick up. "Eric," she said as soon as I answered, her voice shaky. "I heard about what happened. Jessica told me everything." "Did she?" I replied, my voice flat. "What did she say? That I embarrassed her? That I hit her precious Mark?" "No," Rachel said quietly. "She didn't say that. She's a mess, Eric. She knows she screwed up. Good for her," I said bitterly. "What do you want, Rachel?" "I want to talk to you," she said, sniffling. "In person, please." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'm not going anywhere." "Then give me the address of the hotel," she said, her voice firm. "Please, Eric, I need to talk to you." When Rachel showed up an hour later, she looked just as wrecked as I felt. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair pulled into a loose bun, and she was clutching a box of tissues like a lifeline. She stepped into the room and stood there for a moment, looking around as if trying to gauge my mood. "Thanks for letting me come," she said softly. I shrugged, motioning for her to sit down. "What's so important you had to come all the way here?" She didn't sit right away. Instead, she stood by the edge of the bed, twisting the tissue box in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, Eric." "For what?" I asked, leaning back in the chair. "You didn't cheat on me." Her face crumpled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "No, but I knew. I knew she was cheating. And I didn't tell you. I didn't say anything. I just watched as she wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself. "I wanted to," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but I couldn't. I thought maybe she'd stop. Maybe she'd realize what an incredible man she has, what an incredible life she's throwing away. My chest tightened at her words, but I stayed silent, letting her continue. And the worst part is Eric. I was jealous, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Of her. Of you. Of everything you had together. I frowned, sitting up straighter. Jealous? Why would you? Because I've been in love with you, she said, cutting me off. For years. All the time you were dating Jessica. All the time you were married, I loved you. I was happy for her, happy she had someone like you, but I couldn't make the feelings go away. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Rachel? Rachel, who had always been there for Jessica, for us, who had always been the cheerful, supportive friend? I didn't know what to say. She smiled through her tears, shaking her head. I know it's crazy. I try to move on. I dated other guys, but none of them ever made me feel the way you do. And when I saw Jessica throwing it all away, I thought, maybe there's a chance you'd finally see me. Rachel. I started, but she interrupted me. I'm not saying this to pressure you, she said quickly. I needed you to know. And I needed you to know I'm here for you. Whatever you need, anything. You can live with me if you don't want to stay here. I'll help you get through this. She leaned forward, pulling me into a hug, her arms warm and comforting. Then she kissed me on the cheek, her lips lingering for a moment. For a brief second, I thought about it, about Jessica's betrayal, about how satisfying it would be to repay her in kind, to sleep with her best friend, to hurt her the way she hurt me. But I pushed the thought away. Rachel wasn't Jessica. She didn't deserve to be part of some revenge scheme. She was a good person, kind, loyal, and selfless. I couldn't use her like that. Thank you, I said, pulling back gently. But I can't. Rachel nodded, her eyes shimmering with understanding. I get it, she said softly. But my offer still stands, Eric. Whatever you need. I watched as she left, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Gratitude, guilt, sadness. And somewhere, buried deep, a glimmer of something I couldn't quite name. Something I wasn't ready to face yet. A week after leaving, I found myself pulling into the driveway of the house that no longer felt like home. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, but the sight of the familiar front door made my stomach churn. I wasn't here to reconcile. I just wanted to see Max. Still, I knew I'd have to face Jessica. There was no avoiding it. When she opened the door, she looked different, smaller somehow. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders slumped. She offered a hesitant smile. Eric, where's Max? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He's napping, she said, stepping aside to let me in. But we need to talk. I followed her into the living room, my arms crossed. The air between us was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. She sat down on the couch and motioned for me to join her, but I stayed standing. Eric, she began, her voice soft, almost pleading, I'm sorry. For everything. I know I hurt you. I know I ruined our marriage, but I want to make things right. Please, give me another chance. I scoffed, shaking my head. Jessica, you don't just fix something like this. You betrayed me. You lied to me. You destroyed everything we had. It was a mistake, she said quickly, tears welling in her eyes. A horrible, stupid mistake. I'll do anything to make it right. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I'll change. Her words felt hollow, rehearsed. I'd heard enough apologies to know when someone was saying what they thought I wanted to hear. I don't believe you, I said flatly. Betrayal like this can't be forgiven. You made your choice, Jessica. Now you have to live with it. Her expression hardened, the tears vanishing as quickly as they'd come. Oh, so you're perfect? She snapped, her tone turning sharp. You think this is all my fault? Yeah, I do, I said, my voice rising. Because it is. She laughed bitterly, standing up. Of course you do. You always need to be the victim, don't you? Maybe if you weren't so wrapped up in your work, so distant, I wouldn't have felt so. Don't you dare blame this on me. I interrupted, my hands balling into fists. You had a choice, Jessica, and you chose to cheat. That's on you. Fine, she spat. But don't act like you're some saint. I know about Rachel. I blinked, stunned. What about Rachel? Oh, come on, Jessica said, rolling her eyes. She's been in love with you for years. Everyone knows it. She's pathetic, honestly. Always hanging around, hoping you'll notice her. Her words struck a nerve. Rachel has been nothing but a good friend, I said coldly. She's more loyal than you've ever been. Jessica's face twisted in anger. Of course, you defend her. God, you probably love the attention. Do you even care how this looks? Your little hotel rendezvous, her running to you like a lovesick puppy. That's enough, I snapped, my voice shaking. Rachel isn't the problem here. You are. Our fight escalated, each word sharper than the last. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pulsing with the weight of everything left unsaid. By the time I stormed out, I was shaking with rage. Driving away from the house, Jessica's words echoed in my mind. Her dismissiveness, her refusal to take full responsibility, her pathetic attempt to deflect blame onto Rachel. It was infuriating. And it made one thing clear. Jessica wasn't sorry. Not really. She was sorry she'd been caught. For the first time, I didn't just want to move on. I wanted revenge. Real revenge. Not just to hurt her, but to take back control, to remind her that actions have consequences. Jessica had betrayed me, disrespected me, and thrown away everything we'd built. It was time for her to understand what that felt like. The drive back to the hotel was a blur, my mind racing with anger and resolve. Jessica wanted to deflect blame, to paint herself as the victim in this mess. But I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story. If she wanted to ruin our marriage, fine. But I'd make sure everyone knew the truth about what she'd done. I spent the rest of the evening compiling everything. The text from her second phone, the screenshots of her messages with Mark, the receipts, and even the photo of her and Mark entering the hotel together. I packaged it all into a single email, simple and to the point. Subject: the truth about Jessica. To our family and friends. I never thought I'd have to send an email like this, but after what's happened, I can't keep silent. Over the past few months, Jessica has been having an affair with a man named Mark. The evidence is attached. I've tried to be a good husband. I've given her everything I could, but she chose to betray me and our family. I'm sharing this because I believe the people closest to us deserve to know the truth. Please keep Max in your thoughts. He's my priority now. Eric. I sat at the small desk in my hotel room, staring at my laptop screen. The letter was done, the evidence attached, and my finger hovered over the send button. My heart pounded with a mix of adrenaline and doubt. I'd written the letter in anger, fueled by Jessica's betrayal, her refusal to take responsibility, and her dismissive attitude about Rachel. The world needed to know the truth. But still, something held me back. I thought about Rachel. She'd been there for me in ways I hadn't even realized I needed. Her confession had thrown me off balance, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. Part of me was flattered, touched even, by her vulnerability. But another part, the darker, angrier part, saw an opportunity for revenge. Jessica had betrayed me with Mark. What better way to even the score than to sleep with her best friend? But that wasn't who I wanted to be. Rachel didn't deserve to be used like that. She was kind, loyal, and honest. That's why she didn't deserve Jessica's dismissiveness either. I made up my mind and clicked send. The message was gone. There was no turning back. Not long after, I called Rachel. My voice was shaky, unsure, but I needed to hear hers. Hey, it's me. Eric, she said, surprised. What's going on? I sent the letter, I said bluntly. To everyone. Friends, family, co-workers. They all know now. There was silence on the line for a moment before she said, You did the right thing. People deserve to know the truth. I'm not sure if it's the right thing, I admitted, but it's done. Do you want to come over? She asked hesitantly. We can talk. I hesitated for only a second. Yeah, I'll be there soon. When I arrived at Rachel's house, she opened the door with a tentative smile. Her hair was down, her face free of makeup, and she was wearing a loose sweater and jeans. She looked like the Rachel I'd always known, comfortable, kind, steady. Come in, she said, stepping aside. The living room was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the sterile hotel room I'd been staying in. She poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat on the couch, the silence stretching between us. Do you regret sending it? she asked, breaking the quiet. No, I said after a moment. But I'm not sure what comes next. Rachel nodded, sipping her wine. It's going to get messy, but you'll get through it. Her confidence in me felt strange, almost foreign. Jessica had eroded so much of my self-worth. And here Rachel was, looking at me like I was someone worth rooting for. Thank you, I said, my voice soft. For everything. For being there. She reached out, placing her hand on mine. You don't have to thank me, Eric. You're a good man. You didn't deserve this. Her touch sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. Gratitude, sadness, anger, and something else I couldn't quite name. Before I knew it, I was leaning toward her, and she didn't pull away. Our lips met, tentative at first, then deeper, hungrier. It wasn't just passion. It was years of unspoken feelings, shared pain, and a desperate need for connection. We ended up in her bedroom, the boundaries between comfort and something more blurring entirely. It wasn't just about desire. It was about connection, about finding solace in someone who understood my pain. In that moment, with Rachel's arms around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, peace. But as we lay there afterward, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I like Rachel. I respected her. And that's why I knew this couldn't be some impulsive act of revenge. She deserved better than that. We both did. I don't regret this, I said softly, turning to look at her. But I don't want to hurt you. I don't want this to be about Jessica or Mark. Rachel nodded, her fingers brushing against mine. I understand. But for now, let's just be here. Together. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself breathe. The next day, the fallout from the letter began. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts, some supportive, some outraged. Jessica's mom, Carol, called me in tears, apologizing for her daughter's behavior. I don't know what's wrong with her, Eric, she said. I'm so sorry. My parents were furious on my behalf, their protective instincts kicking in. You don't deserve this, my dad said. We're here for you, no matter what. Then came the messages from friends, some expressing shock, others offering their support. One of Jessica's co-workers reached out, saying they'd always suspected something was going on between her and Mark, but hadn't wanted to interfere. Jessica, predictably, was furious. She called me multiple times, leaving angry voicemails that I didn't bother to listen to. When I finally picked up, her tone was a mix of rage and desperation. You had no right, she yelled. You've humiliated me in front of everyone. You humiliated yourself, I said coldly. I just told the truth. You're unbelievable, she hissed. You think this makes you the good guy? You've destroyed everything. No, Jessica, I said, my voice steady. You destroyed everything. I just made sure people knew. Her tone shifted, turning pleading. Eric, please. Let's talk. We can still fix this. There's nothing left to fix, I said, hanging up before she could say more. 2 months. That's how long it had been since my world fell apart. It felt both like a blink of an eye and an eternity. In those 8 weeks, I'd learned more about myself and about the people around me than I ever thought possible. The initial firestorm of Jessica's betrayal had quieted, but the embers still smoldered. I'd started seeing a therapist on Rachel's recommendation, someone to help me untangle the mess of emotions I was carrying. Anger, sadness, guilt, relief. They were all there, sometimes overlapping, sometimes coming out of nowhere. My therapist had suggested an exercise in forgiveness. Not for Jessica's sake, but for mine. It's not about condoning her actions, she'd said. It's about freeing yourself from the hold those actions have on you. I wasn't there yet, but I was trying. Not because I wanted to let Jessica off the hook, but because I wanted to move on without carrying the weight of her choices. Forgiving her felt like a mountain I wasn't sure I could climb, but at least now, I was standing at the base of it looking up. The best part of my week was always seeing Max. I'd pick him up from the house, our old house, and bring him to the small rental I'd moved into. It wasn't much, but it was ours. We'd build forts in the living room, eat way too many chicken nuggets, and watch every animated movie Netflix had to offer. For a few hours, it felt like the world wasn't broken. Jessica was civil when I came to get Max, but we hardly spoke. Our exchanges were brief and to the point, limited to schedules and logistics. Sometimes, I'd catch her looking at me like she wanted to say something, but I never gave her the chance. Whatever she had to say, I didn't want to hear it. Max adjusted to the changes better than I expected. He loved his 2 houses and seemed to enjoy the time he had with me. But sometimes, when I tucked him into bed at the rental, he'd ask, "Why can't you and Mommy live in the same house anymore?" I'd give him the same gentle answer every time. "Mommy and I both love you very much, buddy, but sometimes grown-ups need to live in different houses to be happy." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was the best I could do. I'd finally told my lawyer to start the divorce proceedings. Signing the papers felt surreal, like closing the door on a chapter one wasn't sure I'd ever wanted to end. But the more distance I got from my old life, the clearer it became that there was no saving it. Jessica had made her choices, and now I was making mine. Somewhere along the way, Jessica found out about Rachel and me. I wasn't sure how. I hadn't told her, and neither had Rachel, but Jessica's reaction was explosive. She called me one night, her voice trembling with rage. "How could you?" she shouted. "How could you sleep with Rachel? My best friend." I stayed calm, letting her vent. "I didn't sleep with Rachel to hurt you," I said. "What happened between us wasn't about you." "Wasn't about me," she snapped. "She's been in love with you for years. She was waiting for this, waiting for me to screw up so she could swoop in and take you." "That's not what happened," I said evenly. "But even if it was, do you really think you have the moral high ground here? You cheated on me, Jessica. You lied to me, and you destroyed our marriage. You don't get to tell me who I can and can't be with now." Jessica's anger turned bitter. "You think she cares about you? She just wants what I had. She's not going to make you happy, Eric. She's not me." "You're right," I said coldly. "She's not you. And that's a good thing." She hung up, furious, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. Her inability to take responsibility for her actions, even now, was staggering. But it also made me realize just how much I'd outgrown her. From what little I heard through mutual friends, Jessica's relationship with Mark wasn't going well. Whatever fantasy they'd created during their affair didn't hold up under the weight of real life. Mark wasn't the charming escape she'd envisioned. He was a flawed, selfish man who didn't want the responsibility of someone else's baggage. Apparently, they'd fought more than once about the fallout from my email. Mark didn't like being the bad guy, and Jessica didn't like being held accountable. I heard they'd broken up recently, though I couldn't bring myself to care. She'd made her choice, and now she was living with it. Rachel and I saw each other often. It wasn't always romantic. Sometimes we'd just sit and talk or take Max to the park together. But there was an ease between us, a connection that felt natural. She didn't try to rush me into anything, didn't push for answers about what we were or where we were going. She just showed up, and that was enough. The more time I spent with Rachel, the more I realized how much freedom I'd gained since leaving my old life behind. Freedom from Jessica's manipulations, from the weight of her betrayal, from the constant struggle to fix something that was already broken. For the first time in years, I felt strong. I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to live again. And while the future was still uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. I was finally free.